You're watching Euronews Tonight. I'm Mariam Zaidi, and these are the headlines this hour. President Joe Biden says we will come after you and find you following a US operation in Syria that killed the ISIL leader Abu Ibrahim al-Qurayshi. Turkey's President Erdogan says he's ready to host crisis talks between Ukraine and Russia as he was in Kiev meeting his Ukrainian counterpart. Northern Ireland's First Minister Paul Givan resigns in protest over post-Brexit trade rules as a dispute over checks on food and agricultural goods escalates.
And Russia retaliates against Germany in a dispute over broadcasters. We'll have the story here in the Cube.
Good evening. US President Joe Biden says a major terrorist threat to the world has been taken out. Abu Ibrahim al-Qurayshi, the leader of the so-called Islamic State, was killed in Syria during an overnight raid by American special forces. Biden says the terror group commander was responsible for multiple atrocities, including genocide.
He was responsible for the recent brutal attack on a prison in northeast Syria holding ISIS fighters, which was swiftly addressed by our brave partners in the Syrian Democratic Forces. He was the driving force behind the genocide of the Yazidi people in northwestern Iraq in 2014. We all remember the gut-wrenching stories, mass slaughters that wiped out entire villages, thousands of women and young girls sold into slavery, rape used as a weapon of war. And thanks to the bravery of our troops, this horrible terrorist leader is no more.
US officials say a fierce gun battle took place around the compound housing al-Qurayshi, including helicopter gunfire. The raid took place in the city of Atme in Idlib province in northwestern Syria, one of the last remaining hotbeds of ISIS fighters. The target was al-Qurayshi, who took over as head of the group after its former leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, died during a US operation in the same area in 2019. The White House says al-Qurayshi detonated a bomb that killed him and members of his own family. There were no US casualties, but up to 13 people, including women and children, were reportedly killed during the raid. Well, for more on this story, let's now cross over to DC to our correspondent Ray Suarez. Ray, good to see you. So President Biden is calling this a successful mission, but up to 13 people have been killed. Has there been criticism of these civilian deaths?
Well, Mariam, seemingly in anticipation of just those kind of questions, the American president went into great detail during the news conference that you just saw excerpts of, describing the raid and describing the methods and the operational details. He wanted to show that this method for attacking the compound was chosen rather than a drone strike or a remote strike using a smart bomb or missile. They wanted to get in close, the president said, to minimize civilian casualties. And then he went on further, as we just heard a moment ago, to explain that the casualties on the ground at that site in Atma, near the Turkish-Syrian border, was detonated by the suspect himself, by the target of the attack himself, so that, if anything, the responsibility for those civilian deaths is his. The helicopters that came in over the compound made announcements over loudspeakers in Arabic, telling people to clear the area, to leave the adjacent buildings, and said, if you do not leave, you will die. There was an attempt, apparently, to minimize civilian casualties on the ground. Mariam?
Right now, ISIS, they've been trying to mount a resurgence. Last month, they staged a prison break-in in Syria, freeing members of their group. But will the death of al-Qurayshi deal a fatal blow to the group?
Well, American intelligence forces have been watching the ISIS movements very closely. There was a lot of speculation late in the Trump administration that depriving ISIS of territory, taking away that vast swath of land that it controlled on both sides of the Syria-Iraq border, in effect neutralized ISIL as a fighting force. But there were intelligence analysts, both inside and outside government, who said no, in fact, the group would even be made more dangerous by the deprivation of territory, by being constantly on the run and more desperate and more willing to take large numbers of lives in raids and actions. So American intelligence sources have been watching movement, watching activity very closely, and there was an anticipation that they were ready to take the field again and start stepping up their attacks. This man killed today by American forces is known to have been an expert in operations in the field. Not much on the propaganda front, not much on the high public profile front like his predecessors. So yes, they were worried about new attacks in American intelligence.
Okay, Ray Suarez, thank you so much for that analysis. Thank you so much from DC. Northern Ireland's First Minister Paul Givan has stepped down. It follows talks between UK Brexit lead Liz Truss and the European Commission's Maroš Šefčovič after a violation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. The DUP's leader's resignation comes amid continued trade talks. Agricultural Minister Edwin Poots ordered all Brexit checks on food and farm products entering the territory to end from midnight on Thursday. However, Prime Minister Boris Johnson says checks are continuing. This is a matter for the Northern Ireland executive to resolve. Well, for more, we're now joined by our correspondent in Brussels, Shona Murray. So, Shona, what has come of these emergency talks then between the UK and the EU Commission over this unilateral move by Northern Ireland to end those custom checks?
Well, in the last half hour or so, Liz Truss, the UK's Foreign Secretary, and Maroš Šefčovič, the EU's Brexit negotiator, have had a meeting that was already pre-planned. We've just heard from Liz Truss saying that it was a good meeting. We don't know much of the details, but we know this has been a very difficult day for Brexit. I'm joined now by Ireland's Foreign Affairs Minister, Simon Coveney. Minister, first of all, just clear up the situation here. What is the impact of the Northern Ireland Agricultural Minister saying that checks won't happen anymore on the border between GB and NI?
Well, first of all, last night, the Agricultural Minister in the devolved government in Northern Ireland, who's a hardline unionist, said that he has instructed his officials to no longer undertake checks, sanitary and phytosanitary checks, on goods coming into Northern Ireland from GB, which is, of course, a requirement under the Northern Ireland Protocol. As it happens, his officials have not taken that instruction, and they're continuing to maintain checks today, and they say that they're getting legal advice in terms of what legal obligations they have. But what's very clear here is that the protocol is part of the withdrawal agreement and part of an international treaty between the EU and the UK. It is part of international law. And so the British government have a responsibility to ensure that those checks take place, regardless of whether there is an individual minister playing politics with these issues. So, you know, it was an unfortunate announcement last night, and it's been followed by a DUP or a unionist First Minister in Northern Ireland resigning this afternoon to collapse devolved government in Northern Ireland, again in protest at the protocol. So I think this is a time for cool heads. It's a time to recognise that there are elections on the way in Northern Ireland and that people are trying to position themselves and their parties for those elections. And we need to keep our eye on the goal here, which is to achieve a compromise agreement between the EU and the UK on how we implement the Northern Ireland Protocol and the withdrawal agreement. Because if we can't implement the withdrawal agreement, well, then, of course, that calls into question whether we can implement the trade and cooperation agreement between the EU and the UK, which would be, of course, a very serious development indeed that nobody wants.
So what could happen here is that the trade and cooperation agreement, the trade agreement negotiation between the EU and the UK could be suspended if the UK doesn't ensure those checks take place.
No, that's not what I'm saying, and I don't think we're there yet. But what we have said consistently is that if the British government refuse to abide by their legal obligations under international law and effectively don't operate the protocol as we all agreed, well, then that undermines the capacity for the TCA to operate. But I don't think we should be in the space of threats here. The focus at the moment between Maroš Šefčovič and Liz Truss is very much on finding compromise positions, landing zones and agreements in terms of how we implement the protocol in a way that both sides can agree to in the context of Northern Ireland. But unfortunately, as ever, this has had a really polarising impact on society and politics in Northern Ireland. And now we're in the build-up to an election in Northern Ireland at the latest in early May. And so we are seeing now some politicians, unfortunately, using the protocol to generate political momentum in the build-up to those elections, which is unfortunate and unhelpful.
What do you think the implications will be now of Paul Givan, Northern Ireland's First Secretary, resigning today?
Well, I mean, the way in which the political structures in Northern Ireland work is that if the First Minister resigns, then what's called the Deputy First Minister. So in Northern Ireland, you have a requirement for shared government between unionists and nationalists. And there's a unionist First Minister and there's a nationalist Deputy First Minister. If the First Minister resigns, then the Deputy First Minister is also forced to resign, and the executive or the devolved government in Northern Ireland collapses. Ministers stay in office in a caretaker role, but substantial policy decisions can't be made or discussed. And so effectively what's happened now is that because of the actions of one political party in Northern Ireland against the wishes of all of the others, Northern Ireland is now paralysed effectively in terms of its ability to be able to make political decisions because there is no functioning devolved government. And that looks like it's going to be the state of play in Northern Ireland until there's an election. And I think the tactic here is to try to make the election in Northern Ireland about the protocol, which is very divisive and very unhelpful, as many of us work hard to try to find compromise agreed positions to be able to ensure that the British government complies with not only with international law, but within international law that the British government wrote themselves with the EU in the context of the Brexit withdrawal agreement.
In terms of trust, I suppose, where does this leave the negotiations that were ongoing before Christmas between the EU and the UK? If today you had George Eustace, Minister in the UK in the House of Commons, saying and reiterating what's been said, that it's not up to the UK to ensure that these checks take place, not up to the UK government. That's something obviously you disagree with. And in the meantime, Liz Truss is having negotiations with Maros Sefcovic about how to make the protocol better. And then in Northern Ireland, you have a collapsed executive, perhaps, and at least one very potent party saying they're not going to implement the checks.
Well, I mean, what it means is ongoing uncertainty, instability, tension, polarisation, and bad politics in Northern Ireland. I think it's also important to say, regardless of what a British government minister may say today, the facts here are very clear. The British government has an obligation to comply with international law and treaties that it's signed up to. And that includes implementing checks that are linked to the protocol. Of course, we're trying to negotiate with them to reduce the number of checks that are required to make the protocol as implementable as possible in a way that everybody can live with. That's an ongoing negotiation. But the idea that the British government can simply set aside large elements of the protocol and then blame it on devolved government in Northern Ireland is not a credible position, and I don't believe it's a legally sound position either.
OK, Minister for Foreign Affairs for Ireland, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, anytime.
All right, Shona, thank you so much for that update on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Thank you so much. OK, well, we're now going to take a very short break, but do stay with us on Euronews Tonight. Lots more to come. Welcome back to the programme. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has offered to host talks between Ukraine and Russia to try to find an end to the current crisis. Erdogan was in Kiev meeting his Ukrainian counterpart, President Volodymyr Zelensky, who welcomed the offer. The two leaders signed a free trade deal, amongst other agreements. Now, Turkey has ties to both Moscow and Kiev, but the Turkish leader stressed his full support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. Well, for more on that story, we're now joined by our Russia analyst, Galina Polinskaya. Galina, good to see you again. President Erdogan has offered to play a mediating role between Russia and Ukraine. Zelensky has, of course, welcomed it. Moscow, too, considering it's closest to Turkey. But how will the US and European leaders look at this?
Good evening. Well, Turkey is a member of NATO, is a NATO member country. So if it finds a way to put Russia and Ukraine at the same table and organize them talking with each other, of course, this should be welcomed and it would be a great news. But it's not that easy. You see, even though President Erdogan meets often with President Putin and thinks that he can have a frank conversation with him, a question is whether Russia would be ready for Turkey to be a negotiator. You see, Turkey has close ties together with Russia and Ukraine. It is involved together with Russia in several global conflicts, in Syria, for example, but at the same time it provides Ukraine with weapons, drones, and Russia says that Turkish drones were involved, were used against the separatists in the east of Ukraine, and of course Russia was not happy about that. So when President Putin's spokesman was asked about a possibility of Turkey to be a negotiator, he said that all the efforts, of course, are welcomed, and we know that Mr. Putin already agreed that he might visit Turkey, but the date is not confirmed yet, it's vague. And Mr. Peskov, his spokesman, said that what was important is that they have heard the signals from Turkey that it was ready to invite the representatives of these separatist regions to the table of the talks, and that's clearly what Russia wants at this particular point, and the question is whether Ukraine would be ready for that.
Right, and Galina, we know that President Macron will talk to both Putin and Zelensky later today. Now, he's also expected to go to Moscow, as is Germany's Chancellor. Could we possibly see talks with these four leaders?
Well, actually, this could be one of the most important goals of President of France, Emmanuel Macron, who is, if everything went as it was planned, talking right now, this particular moment, over the phone with Mr. Putin, and after he will speak with Volodymyr Zelensky. Many analysts here think that what France wants is to organize, to bring the Normandy format talks on the higher level. It's where France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia are sitting together and trying to solve, to find the solution to the conflict on the east of Ukraine. But this Normandy format has been frozen, and just recently, a week ago, it started to work again. Political advisors met here in Paris, and nothing much came out of this meeting, but they decided that they will meet again on the level of political advisors in Berlin very soon. And so what France wants is that probably foreign ministers of the Normandy format meet, and even a summit could be organized. But what Russia says, and what Vladimir Putin could probably say tonight to Mr. Macron, is that Russia wants France and Germany to push Ukraine to fulfill the Minsk agreements, and what Russia wants is by the time when political advisors meet in Berlin, is that the status of Donbass is, the question of the status of Donbass is answered. That's what clearly Russia says, and it says that it is not really ready for another summit at this particular point. But of course, let's see what comes out of these talks.
Indeed. Well, Galina, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you for updating us on all those moving chess pieces. Thank you so much. Well, to discuss in more detail the potential impact of a conflict between Russia and Ukraine on the European energy market, we're now joined by Dr. Jack Sharples, who's a research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Dr. Jack Sharples, thank you so much for being on Euronews tonight. Now, this is a geopolitical crisis that has such far-reaching consequences for the European energy market, given that dependence on Russian gas. So how vulnerable is Europe should things escalate either via sanctions or military conflict? Can Europe also perhaps draw on its own gas reserves? Take us through these likely scenarios, if you could.
Sure. So I think, first of all, you're absolutely right to mention that Europe is vulnerable. If we take Europe to mean the EU plus the UK, then actually we depend on imports for about 85% of the gas that we consume in a given year. So the question of where we get our imports from is a very important one for us. Now, Russia supplied around 31% of European gas supply last year via pipelines, plus another 4% via its LNG tankers from the Yamal project in the north. So Russia is the largest external supplier of gas to Europe. And if the current situation around the Ukrainian border were to escalate into a full-blown military conflict and Russian supplies to Europe were to be interrupted, then Europe would find it very difficult to replace those supplies at short notice. We have seasonal storage stocks that we could draw down more quickly, but those stocks are actually at their lowest point for this time of year for about a decade, and we run the risk of actually emptying them before the start of winter, which would hinder our ability to react to any short-lived change in weather-driven demand, let's say. Now, the alternative is to look for additional volumes from the global LNG market. But the problem there is that market is already really rather tight. There isn't a lot of spare going around. So if Europe were to attract any more LNG cargoes, then what it would be doing is trying to divert cargoes that would be previously destined for another market, most notably Asia. That raises the possibility that Europe could get into some kind of bidding war with its counterparts in Asia for the supplies that are sort of out there on the ocean, as it were. So the situation is not really particularly promising for Europe, but there is at least the potential that if any disruption to Russian supplies was only localized and limited, for example, the supplies that are delivered via Ukraine, that then at least we could draw on our seasonal storage stocks a bit quicker, try and get a little bit more LNG, but the immediate impact would be felt in prices. If the conflict in the east were to escalate at all, then I think we would see an immediate price reaction on the European market just because of the uncertainty that it would bring.
OK, well, Dr. Jack Sharples, thank you so much for that analysis there on Euronews Tonight. Thank you so much. Well, still to come on the programme, Matthew is in the Cube.
Marianne will be taking a closer look at the ongoing dispute between Russia, Germany and public broadcasters. More on that after the break.
Welcome back to Euronews Tonight. Russia has taken a series of retaliatory measures against the German public broadcaster Deutsche Welle. It comes after a German media regulator had banned the Russian state channel. RT, Matthew in the Cube, has more.
Well, Mariam, amid heightened tensions over Ukraine, relations between Berlin and Moscow have taken another hit. And this time it focused on the Russian state broadcaster, Russia Today, known as RT, as well as the German public broadcaster, Deutsche Welle, DW. It was on Wednesday that a German media regulator banned RT from airing its German language channel in Germany, saying that it did not have a valid license under European law. Now, Moscow said that this was a political decision and infringement on free speech rights, and the country's foreign ministry threatened to retaliate against German media. Well, now those retaliatory measures have been announced. Russia has focused on Deutsche Welle. They have closed its office in Moscow and said that the accreditations of its staff will be withdrawn. Deutsche Welle could also be classed as a foreign agent, and that means it will face further government scrutiny in Russia. And these sanctions don't just affect the broadcaster. Russia says it will also take action on any representatives who are involved in that decision to ban RT. Well, for their part, Deutsche Welle have said that this is not a tit for tat because they themselves have not violated any licensing rules. And what's more, Mariam, the German Cultural Ministry have released a statement urgently appealing that Russia turns down this unacceptable decision because they say there needs to be clear relations for this mutual relationship and these broadcasters to work.
All right, Matthew, thanks for updating us on that. OK, well, unfortunately, that's it for the programme. You've been watching Euronews Tonight. Take care. Goodbye.